Come on in, pull up a chair and take a load off, because today I'm going to embark on an old school flashback and take a look at the Advanced Dungeons & Dragons Dungeon Master's Guide from TSR Hobbies, Inc. And we'll begin our stroll down memory lane right after this. Howdy, 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 gang. Welcome once again to the Duct Tape Studios. I'm Jeff McAleer, your host here at the Gaming Gang channel. The old school for the New Year's celebration continues all throughout January as I take a look at old school role-playing games, old school Renaissance role-playing games, and RPGs that just have a bit of the old school vibe, even if they're not considered OSR. Well, you don't get much more old school than Advanced Dungeons & Dragons. I don't own AD&D. I don't own the box set. But I do have the original, even though they're not the first printing, AD&D books. So I've already taken a peek at 1977's Monster Manual, 1978's Player's Handbook, and of course, that means today I'm taking a peek at 1979's Dungeon Master's Guide. So this is, I think this is a fourth or fifth printing, and I'll explain why I think it is when we dive on in. So a few things I do want to point out before we start taking a peek. This is not a review of any type. This isn't like a deep dive overview. It is just to give you a feel for what's in the DM's guide. I know a lot of people out there have probably seen this in PDF. Some folks probably haven't seen it, in video, kind of get a little up close and personal with it. I'm going to share some trivia about the DM's guide, as well as some memories of my own regarding this book also. I'll even talk a little bit about if you're looking to possibly collect AD&D books, what to look for, and the kind of pricing you can expect on the secondary market. So to start off, we've got the iconic image of the battle with the Ifrit right on the cover. And it's kind of funny because this is a little off center, if you notice, because of the Advanced D&D kind of like banner here. So I've always thought that was kind of interesting how the book cover seems a little off center, because it is. But this is an iconic image. And then this is actually a complete image all the way onto the back. I know a lot of people over the years thought that this was a separate image, but it's not. It is actually one long kind of like gatefold, kind of a spread. And this is the City of Brass, which wasn't really tackled in Dungeons and Dragons until, I think it was the mid-90s, 94, 95-ish. So I thought that's kind of interesting that we're introduced to the City of Brass, but we never really learn about it until years later. So it says, Dungeon Masters everywhere, rejoice! Too long have you had to suffer along with crucial charts and tables spread through many works. Too long have you had to use makeshift references trying to solve the problem. What problem? That's what I always kind of wondered. It's like, what problem are you talking about? Probably a few problems, not just one. You now have a complete compilation of the most valuable material for your refereeing, the Dungeon Master's Guide. Herein you will find combat matrices, encounter tables, monster attacks alphabetically listed, treasure and magic tables and descriptions, gem values by type, random wilderness terrain generation, random dungeon generation, suggestions on game mastering, and a whole lot more. It is an absolute must for every dungeon master. Let's pop on in. So one thing you're going to find with a lot of copies of the D&D books on the secondary market is that you will usually, not always, but usually you're going to find some writing within. With this copy here, as far as I could ever tell, I got to be honest, I have not paged through each and every page of this at like great, detail. I think this is the only writing that I've got. And of course, it's the person who owned the book. Originally, they, of course, wrote their name in it, which is not unusual. We see that a lot. So this is a special reference work. The reason why I think this is either fourth or fifth printing is because it is 1979. It is showing that this is a revised edition from December of 1979. And there are a couple of appendices in the back that I know were not added until the fourth print of this. So few things about this book that are kind of unusual. And one of them, of course, is the whole story of basic D&D and advanced D&D. Even at this point in time, there was a basic Holmes edition of D&D. Some people refer to it as Blue Holmes because it came in a blue box. But then we had advanced D&D. So the rules were kind of all over the place. So you had the original Dungeons and Dragons, which, if you're not familiar with that, that came in a box set with 3 booklets. And then you had in 70, I think it was 79, summer of 79, we had the basic box come out. And that was the rules references. That was, it's like I said, considered, some people like to call it Blue Holmes. And then, of course, we had advanced D&D. And we had the Monster Manual come out in 77. Player's Handbook came out in 78. And then this came out in 79. So strangely enough, you had these rules all over the place. So when the Monster Manual came out, you had a lot of people who were playing Dungeons and Dragons with the original D&D rules, OD&D, because the box set, the basic set, did not exist yet. And they were utilizing the monsters from the Monster Manual, which strangely enough did not have the experience points for the monsters in the book. They're actually located in Dungeon Master's Guide. Then you had the Player's Handbook come out, which had not all, but the vast majority of the character creation rules within that, and the spells, and some aspects of gameplay, but not everything. So before this came out, you had people who were just kind of playing kind of a mashup of original D&D with the Monster Manual and the character classes, the character races from the Player's Handbook. So it's kind of a mess. So it's no joke when it says, hey, this is a comprehensive compilation of important information, because honestly, it really was. So we get an introduction, we get some approaches to the game. So about the first 50 pages or so is kind of like the second portion of the rules to actually play the game, which modern gamers would think, what? Because these days, usually it's the Player's Handbook or Player's Guide or whatever you want to consider it, whatever role-playing game system titles their kind of core book, that has all the rules, and then a Game Master's Guide has tips to running the game and creating adventures and things like that. That's not the case here. Now, we will get into some Dungeon Master facing content after about the first 50 or so pages, but early on, this is kind of information that's available, that should be available to the players as well. So another aspect of the Dungeon Master's Guide is that information is scattered all throughout this thing. It is not the most intuitive book you will ever see. In fact, it's one of the least intuitive role-playing game books ever. It's almost as if we have page upon page of just like little articles that were tossed in here. I guarantee, and I got to be honest, it's been a long time since I read this, sat down and read the Dungeon Master's Guide. It's probably been decades. But even then, I still remember that it was like, wait, wouldn't that information be better suited back when I was reading about XYZ? Why is ABC here? Shouldn't it be over there? And I guarantee anybody reading through this for the first time is going to be kind of, or I shouldn't say the first time. People who have read this, even longtime gamers, I guarantee if they read this again, they'd be like, wow, I don't remember that rule. Wow, that rule existed? Because there was so much in the Dungeon Master's Guide that Dungeon Masters just ignored. It's true. It is very true. We've got some really nice artwork throughout. Something else, and I did mention this when we were taking a look at the Monster Manual. A lot of people originally think this was like marketed to kids. It wasn't. Dungeons and Dragons was never originally marketed to kids. It was marketed to college age gamers. And that's why we'll actually see some partial nudity and some images that the female creatures or characters are topless. If this was marketed towards kids, that would never have been in here. Now, later on down the line, yes, D&D began to be marketed towards much younger gamers than the original audience. But I have to laugh because, you know, modern gamers taking a look through these books would be like, whoa, wait a second. There's boobs there. What's going on there? Yeah, because this was just not marketed to kids. So we get a actually long section on combat. It's about 20 pages long. And one of the interesting aspects of this is how much, once again, how much of these rules were kind of tossed out by most dungeon masters. Especially the unarmed combat, which is kind of a running gag with me. If you follow the Gaming Gang at all, I do a live show and we talk about everything and anything. It's usually, it's mainly, I should say, tabletop gaming news, and then I take a look at a tabletop game. But I always joke when we talk about crunchy rules for role-playing games, I'm always like, do we really need rules specifically for grappling? Do we? Because that's been a running gag with my friends and I since high school. Even back then, it was like, seriously, grappling rules? Do we really need that? So we've got the various different attack matrices or matrices, however you want to pronounce that. But as you can see, there is a lot of combat info here. We've got our saving throws, discussion about that. We've got insanity rules, experience for treasure. Then we start moving into what I consider to be the game master, dungeon master facing information. And we get discussion about creating your campaign. At this point in time, I don't think there had been changes made to some of the more, I guess we'll say, controversial content that was in here. I have to take a look to see if we've got the random harlot table or not. I think we do. I don't think that was taken out at this point. But we've got constructing your own castles and keeps, magical research for spells and scrolls, got tables galore. Then we start getting into our treasure randomly generating the treasure hoards. Then we get into magical items. So we get quite a few pages about those. Keeping in mind, now, remember, we had stuff out there where it was like, okay, magical treasure, but before this came out, you had no idea what it was supposed to be unless you were utilizing magic treasure from the AD&D rules as opposed to AD&D. So when this finally arrived, then you got all the info, probably more info than anybody really needed regarding various different magical items, artifacts. Here we go, artifacts and relics. And then we get into a slew of appendices. So before we get to this point, I have to point out that if you are a game master of any sort, doesn't matter if you're running Dungeons and Dragons, doesn't matter if you're running old school stuff or 5e or Pathfinder 2nd Edition, you really owe it to yourself to give the Dungeon Master's Guide a read, because there actually is a lot of really interesting information that you can utilize in any game system that's located in this book. Now, of course, it's written in what we like to refer to as High Gygaxian, so the presentation is not modern. I mean, it's not as if you were reading a text from the 18th century or something like that, but it is more technical writing than anything else. But there is still loads and loads of really great advice in the Dungeon Master's Guide for gamers who aren't even running a fantasy role-playing game. So anyway, so we get into the appendices, and we have random dungeon generation. Now, I have heard of a lot of people, including my best friend, Elliot Miller, who actually utilize this to create solo dungeons. I never did that. But I have heard of quite a few people, you know, back in the day, being kids, who utilized this to create random kind of endless dungeons to do solo adventures in. Pretty wild. If you did that yourself, let me know in the comments. I'm kind of curious how that worked out, because I've also heard of various gamers who really didn't have friends who were interested in playing D&D, who would actually run modules, published adventures, solitaire for themselves. That is also not something I ever did. Although, strangely enough, I did that with board games, war games, and that all the time. Never did that with a role-playing game. Speaking of personal nudity, so we get some random monster encounters. We're also going to get our experience points for the monsters. Here we go. There's a rather famous image from the Dungeon Master's Guide here. We get creatures from the lower planes. Here we go. This is the breakdown where we're getting the various different monsters. And here we go, our XP values. Thank you. Only had to wait 2 books to get to it. Was it in the Monster Manual? Thanks. So we've got all that listed. Dungeon dressing. Describing magical substances, herbs, spices, and medicinal vegetables. Conjured animals. Okay, so I'm taking a peek here. Is it the dungeon dressing that has the random? Well, obviously it's not traps. I'm looking for that random harlot table. For some reason, my memory bank is telling me it was Appendix D. But I mean, I could be way off. No, that's random generation of creatures from the lower planes. Maybe that was gone by this point, but I thought it was still in here. Oh, there we go. Bang, right there. Harlot. Harlot encounters can be with brazen strumpets or haughty courtesans. That's like, all right, roll them percentile dice, see what kind of harlot it is. Ah, yes. Okay. Reason why I mentioned that this has got to be the fourth printing or later. I think it's fourth or fifth because it's 1979. It's not later than 79. It's December 79 was this print run. But in the fourth print run is when we get Appendix O, which is encumbrance of standard items, and Appendix P, creating a party on the spur of the moment, which helps kind of streamline the process of creating your adventuring party with your players. Then we get a glossary, and then we get our index, and then we get some advertisements, and then we get some handy dandy aids here for us as well. So got some encumbrance, hirelings, tables, morale, and so on. And that is the Dungeon Master's Guide. So I have to point out, I recall picking mine up in 1979 because that's when I picked up my original 3 volumes was in 1979. Although these are not my originals. Those are long, long gone. And I want to say the MSRP on this was $15. Because I swear, the Player's Handbook and Monster Manual, as far as my memory serves, were $10. And then this was 15. I was kind of like, oh, damn, it's more than the other 2 books, I should say. I know there's discussion. I mentioned this when I talked about the Monster Manual. But I always kind of chuckle when people talk about, oh, how expensive it is to get into, say, 5th edition Dungeons and Dragons with the 3 core books. But the reality is, taking into account inflation and the buying power of the dollar, it's about the same as it always was. So the cost of the 3 core books back in 1979, when we take into account inflation and buying power of the dollar, is pretty much the same as buying the 3 core books now for 5th edition. I find that kind of interesting because I have heard from some folks that talk about, oh, it's too expensive to get into role-playing games. And I always respond to them by saying, well, it's actually absolutely free. I tell them what they can look for, like SRDs and things like that. So anyway, I picked mine up in 79 and they did run 10-10 and then this was 15. Something to keep in mind if you're expecting to maybe start looking to collect the original AD&D books online through the secondary market, say like eBay. I picked this up about a year and a half ago, and I paid like $45. And this is actually in pretty good condition. There's no tears. There's no writing inside except for the original owner or some owner's name written on the inside cover. The pages have aged pretty nicely. They're not all yellowed. Of course, you can see that there was, somebody used this. If they're not, the pages aren't, the ends, the edges of the pages are not, sparkling white or anything like that. But all in all, this is in pretty darn good condition, especially at that price point that I paid. Because a lot of times you're usually going to have notes written in, sometimes in pen. You might have torn pages. I have seen, this was more the monster manuals than anything else. I have seen monster manuals that have been colored in and colored pencil or markers, which I find the ones that I've seen that were colored in marker pretty interesting, because the marker you would think would bleed through to the other side of the page, but they haven't, at least from the pictures I have seen, they have not. You are going to find that you are going to have wear and tear on the edges of the corners on these books, unless you're willing to pay top dollar for a pristine copy. You are going to see little bits of wear. This not too bad, not too shabby. It's still nothing's like coming apart, nothing's fraying on these edges. Something else you want to keep in mind is you see this a lot with the older books. Down along the spine, it like bubbles up. But as you can see on this copy here, the spine is nice and flat. I lucked out when I picked these up. When I picked up my 3 core books, they're all in pretty darn good shape, especially for the price I paid. If you are looking to pick up a DM's guide in good shape over, say, at eBay, you're going to expect to pay between about $60 and $80 is what I normally will see. Now, of course, you can actually get the Advanced Dungeons and Dragons books with the cover artwork from Jeff Easley, much, much cheaper than you can these earlier print runs that have the iconic artwork. I got to be honest, I love that art on those covers. I think they're really nicely done. But I wanted to pick my AD&D books up with the original artwork, kind of for that whole nostalgia factor as well. But you can expect to pay, like I said, about $60 to $80 if you want to go with the later print runs with the different covers. You can actually find some in pretty good shape for about $30, $35. I have seen these covers all beat to hell, depending on what print run it is. Because one thing, the first print run that came out for the Dungeon Master's Guide, the pages weren't correlated correctly. So part of it was the DM's guide and part of it was the monster manual. So TSR actually had to recall the book. So, oops. But anyway, I have seen some of these really beat up later print runs for like $25. So you don't have to go crazy to get a nice copy. Should also point out, you can still get these print on demand or in PDF over at Drive-Thru RPG or DM's Guild. Same thing. Same, it's the one bookshelf sites. And you can get the PDF for $9.99. It is actually a PDF of the limited edition reprints that Wizards of the Coast did back starting in 2012. But all the content inside, except for like random harlot tables, are still there. All right, so that is the Dungeon Master's Guide. And just kind of a look at it and kind of kicking back, having some fun. All right, anyway, I will be back next week because, of course, the old school for the new year celebration is going to rock on. And I am going to dive in and share my copy of Deities and Demigods, which is essentially the 4th core book for Advanced Dungeons and Dragons. So by all means, please swing by to check that out. I'm also going to share a video with my look at my copy of the Fiend Folio, although a lot of people dislike that book a lot. I thought it was okay back in the day. But funny enough, it is the last of the Advanced D&D books that I bought. In fact, I didn't pick up anything from Dungeons and Dragons until I was taking a look at somebody I knew's somebody I knew. somebody I knew at the time, their copy of the 4th edition. I was taking a look at 4E D&D back in the day. But yeah, a lot of years went by without me diving into any D&D stuff. I was running Call of Cthulhu. Run it for decades. Anyway, that is it for this time out. If you like this video, by all means, please give it a quick thumbs up. Subscribe to the Gaming Gang channel if you haven't already. If you do subscribe, ding that bell. It'll not only let you know when I upload videos such as this, it'll also tell you when my live stream, the Gaming Gang Dispatch, airs Monday, Tuesday, and Wednesday evenings right here on YouTube at 7 p.m. Central. And of course, when you're not watching videos on the Gaming Gang channel, be sure to visit thegaminggang.com for all latest in gaming news, reviews, and a whole lot more. You know the drill. Get your geek on at thegaminggang.com. Once again, I'm Jeff McAleer. Thank you so much for hanging out as we took a stroll back down memory lane. And until I see you next time, here's hoping each and every one of you gets to enjoy plenty of great gaming with your gang. Oh, hey, you're still here. Well, if that's the case, by all means, subscribe to the Gaming Gang channel by clicking right here. Check out the latest episode of the Gaming Gang Dispatch, or find out what YouTube recommends you check out from the channel. And of course, once again, I'm Jeff McAleer. Thanks for watching.